Hello and welcome to The Top Story, a podcast with the headlines of the day from our correspondents around the world. I'm Xizhi. Coming up in this edition, millions on Florida's central west coast are seeking shelter after Hurricane Milton made landfall near Siesta Key. US President Joe Biden and Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu have spoken on the phone about potential Israeli retaliation against Iran. And in a surprising trend, more Ukrainians are opting for electric vehicles despite the crippled energy infrastructure under Russian attacks. We begin in North America. Millions on Florida's central west coast are taking shelter after Hurricane Milton made landfall near Siesta Key. Officials call it a life-threatening storm, and state authorities are warning of high winds, deadly storm surge, tornadoes, and heavy rain, as well as statewide power outages as a result of those weather hazards. Philip Crowther with the Associated Press is in Orlando to tell us about the response there.
We're a little bit inland here from where Hurricane Milton made landfall here in Orlando. This is in fact one of the places where people have evacuated to be in a safer place, essentially. There were mandatory evacuation orders in 11 different counties here in Florida. 5.9 million people were told that they should leave their homes before the arrival of this hurricane. Now it's too late for them to leave, and they've been told by local officials that now is the moment to shelter in their own homes wherever it is safest for them to stay. Now obviously with a hurricane what you're going to see is a lot of rain and a lot of wind, but the most dangerous part of this one is going to be the storm surge. This hurricane also has now been downgraded to a Category 2 storm. That is some good news at least, and the storm surge might also be that little bit lower than expected. And it looks like, according to a lot of local officials who had told people to evacuate, like most people have heeded those warnings. It looks like very few people were left on those barrier islands like Siesta Key, that was that precise place where Hurricane Milton made landfall just a short while ago.
That was Philip Crowther in a very windy Orlando. On the Middle East, US President Joe Biden and Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu have spoken on the phone about potential Israeli retaliation against Iran. Biden earlier urged Netanyahu to consider alternatives to hitting Iran's oil sector. Israel has been discussing how to respond to the Iranian missile barrage on October 1st, which the United States helped to fend off. A senior Iranian military advisor has warned that Tehran will respond fiercely if Israel launches retaliatory strikes. Jonathan Regev reports.
What we do know is that it focused mostly on the Israeli planned operation in Iran in retaliation to the barrage of rockets that was fired here from the Islamic Republic last week. We also know from reports that Kamala Harris, the vice president and the Democratic presidential candidate, was also on this call. Not a lot of information. We can assess that the relations between the two are far from being good, but for now, Joe Biden is the American president, and the United States is the one backing Israel against the Iranian attacks. And this call did take place, did focus on the planned Israeli operation in Iran. We know that the Americans are very concerned. They want to make sure that Israel is not doing something major like attacking the Iranian nuclear sites or oil sites.
That was Jonathan Regev in Tel Aviv. More than 1.2 million people in Lebanon are displaced under Israel's bombardment. Inflation has soared past 40%, and food production is coming to a standstill. Basic necessities are becoming prohibitively expensive, fueling fears of a worsening food crisis as the conflict drags on. Evangelist Simpson visited a family taking shelter in a basement in Beirut.
This basement has become Yahya and his family's refuge after fleeing from Israeli airstrikes. It's where the children play, the adults gather, and everyone sleeps. Since the war began, it's the only place they can afford.
Right now we are coping. Prices have skyrocketed everywhere. For example, everything has become more expensive everywhere. Anything you buy is expensive. Prices have doubled or tripled, especially in markets.
With prices skyrocketing, Yahya must work longer hours to make ends meet and provide for his family. What used to be manageable has become an exhausting routine of extended shifts to cover basic needs.
Things were better back then because prices were reasonable. Now everything has doubled. I have to do 9 or even 12-hour shifts to meet some of my family's needs. It's exhausting.
Lebanon's economy was already fragile before the conflict. Although inflation was over 35%, prices were somewhat more stable. However, since the war began, the situation has taken a sharp turn for the worse. Inflation has skyrocketed, surpassing 40%, and the cost of necessities has doubled or even tripled, making it incredibly difficult to afford everyday items like food and fuel.
I used to come out and buy vegetables for the whole week, but now I only buy for the day. Everything has gone up so much, and I'm afraid that it will continue like this. I won't be able to buy anything anymore.
With soaring prices and families barely able to provide the basics, the situation worsens. Farmers and field workers had to leave their farms due to constant airstrikes, leaving empty farms and crops on harvest. This has created halt in food production. As a result, it's pushing up the prices even more.
The directly related sector to the agriculture is the agro-food sector, and the agro-food sector, the industrial agro-food sector in Lebanon, is the larger and the most productive sector in Lebanon. If this sector will stop, we will be facing a food crisis in Lebanon. Because 60% of the food in Lebanon is coming from the agriculture and the agro-food sector.
The future for families like Yahya's is uncertain. Many are already at a breaking point, and Lebanon could soon face a full-blown food crisis, leaving even necessities out of reach for a nation already devastated by conflict.
That was Evangelist Sipsis on the humanitarian crisis in Lebanon. In Asia, Southeast Asian leaders have gathered in Laos for the second day of the ASEAN annual summit. Officials are set to meet with counterparts from China, Japan, South Korea, India, Australia and New Zealand. Chinese Premier Li Qiang has attended the China-ASEAN summit. Ryan Meltzer has the latest.
The day began with the ASEAN-China summit with Laos's Prime Minister, who's the host, describing the relationship between ASEAN and China as robust, substantive and mutually beneficial. And he cited the example, of course, of China having been ASEAN's #1 trading partner for the past 15 years, with ASEAN becoming China's largest trading partner 3 years ago. As well, China is the third largest foreign investor in the region. Now, the two leaders revealed that they have reached substantive agreement on upgrading the China-ASEAN Free Trade Agreement, what's called the 3.0 agreement, and that they're hoping to sign that in next year, 2025. Now, Premier Li also did point to some of the global headwinds that ASEAN and China are facing, of course, geopolitical turmoil, climate change, increased protectionism, uneven global economic growth. And he said that really by combining their populations, China and ASEAN, and their strengths, between them, they have a quarter of the world's population. He said by increasing connectivity and integration between China and ASEAN, that's the best way to combat these kinds of global headwinds.
That was Ryan Meltzer reporting on the ASEAN Annual Forum. Finally, in Europe, Ukraine is seeing a surge in sales of electric vehicles. It is an unlikely trend in a country that is facing severe electricity shortages after Russian attacks destroyed about half of the energy infrastructure. Niguma Lim finds out why more Ukrainians are opting for battery-powered vehicles.
Driving an electric car in a country with a crippled energy system may not seem like a wise choice, but people here are not shying away.
Electric vehicle sales in Ukraine have gone up from 15,900 in 2021 to over 54,000 in the first 8 months of this year.
Andriy bought his first EV in 2022 when the conflict with Russia began.
2.5 years ago, when Russia attacks the Ukraine with the missiles, we've started experiencing issues with the fuel.
Long lines formed outside gas stations. Now, after Russian attacks on the energy grid, electricity and a stable power supply have become an issue. As the cold winter months approach, scheduled power cuts are set to begin again. But EV sales have yet to drop.
August saw the highest number of electric car sales ever in Ukraine, 9,400 compared to the 5,600 in August of last year.
Andriy says he'll plan ahead and charge his car according to the blackout schedule. And he says owning an EV is still a cheaper alternative.
To top up my fuel tank in my truck cost me about 5,000 hryvnias per tank. And to charge this car is like 150.
Analysts say another reason driving up sales are cheap import taxes.
We understand that the import of an ordinary car will cost about 30 to 40% more compared to the cost of importing EVs into Ukraine. You only need to pay a few €100 for an electric car.
EV seller Alexei argues that electric cars can actually be useful during power cuts. They can serve as a giant power bank, supplying electricity to your home. He's been selling devices he built that can turn a charged car into a power source.
This particular car has 60 kilowatts battery. So more or less house consume something about 4 kilowatts in average. And we can use this car as an uninterrupted power supply.
This is a solution many European countries are also looking at to better manage energy supplies in the future. To use EVs not only as an energy source for households, but for repowering the grid. With electricity in short supply in Ukraine, perhaps a power bank on 4 wheels is exactly what people need.
That was Megumelim reporting from Kyiv. Now recapping the headlines. Millions on Florida's central west coast are seeking shelter after Hurricane Milton made landfall near Siesta Key. Authorities have warned about its deadly impact. US President Joe Biden and Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu have spoken on the phone about potential Israeli retaliation against Iran. And more Ukrainians are opting for electric vehicles despite the crippled energy infrastructure under Russian attacks. That's it for this edition of The Top Story, a podcast that brings you world headlines every weekday. For more news in politics, business, sports and culture, you can subscribe to the Beijing Hour, a 1-hour podcast news magazine program. We welcome and appreciate all ratings and reviews. I'm Qizhi. Thanks for listening.